Hi, everyone. So today we're going to begin with chapter 4, which is the first chapter of the beginning of a new period, period 3. Um, and period 3, it goes from 1754 to 1800. So what it does is it takes us through the causes for Americans declaring their independence, starting with chapter 4, and then independence, the Revolutionary War, which will be chapter 5, and then in chapter 6, that is the Constitution and the new republic under the federal party, the Federalist Party. So it'd be Washington, Hamilton, Adams. So we're going to start here with chapter 4. And what it does is kind of lay the groundwork. You're going to see conflict that arises between the colonists and their English counterparts. So this first one, imperial wars and colonial protests. and we'll get started. Okay, so before we can understand about what's going on, we have to do some background. As you know, England and Spain already colonized North America. You have Spain down in the American Southwest, in Mexico, Central America, South America. And then you have the British on the eastern seaboard of the Atlantic in what is now the United States. Well, France is also here. And so we're going to go and we're going to look about how they came and how they colonized the Americas as well. All right, so the French, like the British, they had some difficulty at first getting started because of what was going on in Europe with the Protestant Reformation. Like the British, they were also influenced by Martin Luther and John Calvin, and they embraced some of Calvinist teachings. Now, the people in France who were Calvinists, these were the Huguenots, right? So when we refer to the French Huguenots, that's what we're talking about. So there's a lot of conflict going on between them and the Catholics in France. And France was a very devout Catholic nation, right? So some events transpire, and once things calm down, then people are able to migrate, especially the Huguenots, because they're given the right to do so with the Edict of Nantes, and then they're kind of forced to do so with the reign of Louis XIV. So we're going to talk about each of these events in just a little bit of detail. Okay, so if you look right here, this is a map that shows the various voyages of Jacques Cartier. He sailed on behalf of France way back in 1534, so even before the British. He goes up and he claims that territory in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So I want you to look at the map because these are places that we're going to be discussing as we go through this presentation. You can see down there, that's Nova Scotia and then Prince Edward Island, and then Newfoundland, and then the St. Lawrence River. That is very important, right? And if you look right there, the Leaching Rapids, I've been to those. I don't remember how to pronounce that. But those are some rapids right there, and that's on, I think, the present-day city of, I can't remember if it's Montreal or Quebec, but it's very important to kind of scale those rapids too so you can gain access to the St. Lawrence River and then other locations beyond. So anyway, he lays claim to that territory on behalf of France, but the French don't start to go over for a while, like another 75 years. All right, then there's this guy, Samuel de la Champlain. He's known as the father of New France because he goes and he does, again, reinforce the claim of the territory for France there. And he establishes the city of Quebec in 1607. Now, that's the same date that the English established themselves at Jamestown. So they're kind of on par with one another. Right there. He also establishes friendly relations with the Huron, the Native American tribes that's dominant in that region, and they start a fur trade there too. He allies with the Huron, and they go to war with the Iroquois. Now, the Iroquois later are going to ally themselves with the English, and this is very important because the Huron and other Native Americans in the region want to trade with the French, and the English are going to cut that trade off after the French and Indian War. So anyway, as I said, he is known as the father of New France. And if you look right there, there is a lake. This is where I spent my summer after I graduated from high school. There's a lake right there, Lake Champlain, that bears his name. Okay, so what is created is New France, and what they do is they establish or the group that establishes that is the Company of New France, and it's a joint stock company, but it's controlled by the French government, and they have monopoly over the fur trade. So they're extracting all of these furs from that region of Canada. And in exchange for them getting that, they're required to bring over like 200 or 300 settlers annually to the colony. France wanted to establish that in the name and strengthen it of France, right? But after a while, they just start to lose a lot of money. Louis XIV cancels their charter. It becomes a royal colony. And as we're going to discuss in just a second, um, Louis XIV rules for a very long time, and he rules as an autocrat. What he says goes. He is the government, right? There's no representative assemblies in New France. There really isn't in France either. There's no jury trials, and everybody's supposed to be Catholic. All right, so there's a lot of upheaval that's going on, going back before Louis even, because of the conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics. And one of those events was St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. So Charles the Ninth, when he is the King of France, he ordered that the leaders of the French Huguenots be killed. And what that did is that kind of inspired a whole bunch of mob violence throughout France, in which average everyday Catholic people just go about killing average everyday Huguenots. Um, in the end, from May to October, they estimate that upwards of 70,000 people could have been just slaughtered. So this is a painting depicting that. Many people blame Catherine de Medici. She was like the king's mother or something like that, and she kind of influenced all of this. Well, after this event, as you can imagine, people kind of rethink what happened, maybe feel bad about it, and so they issue something known as the Edict of Nantes, this bottom bullet point there, where Henry IV of France, he granted the Protestants rights to practice their religion, and that also enabled some of them to migrate. But then there's Louis XIV. He comes in. He looks pretty snazzy, right? He moved the royal court to Versailles. It started out as a hunting palace, and it just grew to this elaborate castle. And at Versailles, this is where he held court, and people competed to win over his favor, to have an audience with the king. That kind of elevated your status. Sometimes you were in, sometimes you were out. He did this in an effort to get rid of the nobility. He didn't like feudalism because he didn't want to answer to anybody else but him, right? So what he believed in was absolutism. As you can see there, it's a strong believer of absolutism, divine right. If you go against him, you're going against the God, right? They actually referred to him as the Sun King, and he ruled for a very long time. Look at that, 1643 to 1750. It's believed that he was like one of the longest ruling monarchs in the history of Europe, or he is, right? So anyway, he consolidated his power, but he revokes the Edict of Nantes and requires everybody either be Catholic or you'd have to migrate, right? So he required that the Protestants convert or they had to immigrate, meaning leave. All right, so going back to New France, you had those fur traders there. These people, they were adventurers. They go into the interior. They were known as the Corps de Bois or the Voyageurs. And they went and they trapped beaver almost to extinction. And they didn't want the beaver for their furs. They wanted them for their skin, their pelts. And they would pound the pelts down into kind of a felt. And then from the felt, they would make these hats. And hats were quite popular, right? So they go and they're making a profit off of the fur trade. You also had people going over to spread Catholicism, and there's a specific sect within the Catholic Church called the Jesuit priests. They're highly disciplined priests. There's some Jesuit universities in the United States where the Jesuits still preach. Georgetown is one of them. Preach and teach, right? But Père Marquette was one. He came over and he tried to proselytize the religion and spread Catholicism to the Native Americans. But not only that, um, these we know a lot about what happened when they came here because these Jesuit priests kept these very elaborate records of everything, all that they noticed, kind of like La Casa did for the Spanish. They also mapped things out. So there was a wealth of maps. There's all this information, and they're taking it back. There were other people that would follow these explorers. Antoine Cadillac, he would go down to what was known as the City of Straits, Detroit. We called it Motor City. That's where the automobile industry took off. And as we all know, one of the most famous cars the Americans have ever made are the Cadillacs. And then Robert LaSalle, he's very important too because he's the one that traversed down the Mississippi River. Right, and claimed all of that territory on behalf of France. And for France, that was very important. Okay, so check out this map over here. This is Robert LaSalle's route as he came down through the Great Lakes and then to the Mississippi and claims all this territory on behalf of France. So he starts up there at Fort Fond du Lac, and then he goes to Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, up through Lake Huron. I mean, they're paddling. That's all they had to do, and they just paddled all day long, all day long. And the Jesuits are with them, and they're tracking down and they're keeping records of the maps and the coastal areas and everything else. Then they go down into Lake Michigan, a little bit into Green Bay, come down to where we now have present day Chicago. And then they go and they find the Illinois River. They go down the Illinois River. They go up the Mississippi, and then they go down the Mississippi all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Later, LaSalle's going to come back and try to go the other way and find this river again, but they cannot find it. And they end up over in what is today Texas, where he is killed by some of his own men, right? As a result of that. I'm not sure exactly what the mutiny was all about, but I'm sure you could find out if you did a little research. Okay, so as LaSalle went down there, what he did is he claimed all this territory on behalf of France, and it's very convenient. He's just going to claim all the territory connected by all the water that flows into the Mississippi. So everything from the Appalachian Mountains to the Rocky Mountains is going to be claimed for France. And it's real simple. All you have to do is say this. You just say, "In the name of the most high, mighty, and redoubted monarch Louis the 14th of that name, most Christian king of France and of Navarre, I take possession of this place, Saint Marie du Sault." This might have been up the Great Lakes. As also at Lakes Huron and Superior, the islands of Manitoulin, and all countries, rivers, lakes, and streams contiguous and adjacent thereunto. I'm just going to claim everything that's connected to this. So that's what he did. On behalf of France. And so they get this huge territory that they claim is theirs, and all the people in it are their subjects. And so they go about saying, "You're a Christian, you're a Christian, you're a Christian," because they baptize them too, even though the people don't know what they're saying. Okay, so a very important settlement that they made was establishing New Orleans as they go down there to the mouth of the Mississippi. This was important for them to do that. So he goes down. Well, before they get there, though, they're trying to find a route to the Pacific, right? Nobody ever wants to be in America. It's like, how do we get to the Pacific Ocean and get to Asia? So they're looking to do that. And as they go, they set up these forts. And they're the first Europeans to go into Illinois. And this is around 1673. They're welcomed by the Illinois Indians. Probably the Indians want to trade with them, right? But that's where we get the name Illinois from, the Illinois, right? And then they go down, they establish New Orleans in 1718, and that's in an effort to try to block the Spanish from going up there and then attacking them in the interior as well. So this is important because they're going to gain control of the Mississippi River, which means that they can control trade in later years. All right, the French, really, if you look at some of the names throughout Illinois, you can see that they have their French in their origin. LaSalle, we have Père Marquette State Park. If I sat and thought about it for a while, I'll probably get a lot. Marquette, there's just quite a few. Peoria. even though they were the Peoria Indians. But there's just a lot of names that are French. The French came here and they established what's known as the Gardens of France's North American Empire, more lovingly known as the Bottoms, the American Bottoms. And if you were to go there today, that would be down south of East St. Louis along the Mississippi River. I've gone there a couple of times, and I visited Prairie du Rocher, where they have Fort Charters. This is where you had a French outpost, and later it was taken over by the British after the French and Indian War. And now, annually, a bunch of people come and they reenact something known as a rendezvous. A rendezvous was when colonists and soldiers and Indians would all come together and they would trade in their wares. And you do it like once a year or maybe twice a year, and you would get the things that you need that maybe you don't have access to otherwise. So it's really fun to go because people really get into their character as these white men in loincloths up on the top. You could see. I'm not kidding. You go there, you see a lot of mostly naked people, men, kind of walking around. We walked around one time. This woman's just walking around with her pig. They sell some really neat stuff too, kind of authentic recreations or recreations that are seemingly authentic of something from that time period. But it's really cool. Sorry. So if you ever get the opportunity to do that, it's a fun road trip. It's a whole day's adventure for sure. You could stop at Cahokia. Okay, so in 1750, this is what North American continent looked like. France is in the blue. They've got all that territory that was claimed by Robert La Salle and other Frenchmen as they came through. So the whole Great Lakes, everything there. The British have what's in pink along the eastern seaboard with the 13 original colonies, and then the territory to the south, which is in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, that area in through there, that is controlled in Colorado. That is controlled by the Spanish and also Florida. But if you look up there around Hudson Bay, Newfoundland, and also Acadia, New Brunswick, that area is going to be shared by well, actually, it's going to be claimed by the British, and that's a result of wars that take place between the British and the French and even the Spanish as they're all competing for territory, not just here in North America, but throughout the world. So the competition between England, France, and Spain takes place with a series of war that take about 70, 75 years or so. And the four of them are listed here, right? They're fighting all around the world for territory and claims all around the world. So King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, all named after the monarchs who were in power at that time. And then the final war is going to be the French and Indian War. That's also known as the 7 Years' War in England. Excuse me. So King William's War and then also Queen Anne's War, it's kind of the same battles that were fought here in North America and elsewhere, but they kind of continue on. One kind of leads into another one here in North America, right? So anyway, you have the American colonists going against the Coeur d'Ivoire, and the Coeur d'Ivoire have along with them the Huron and their other Indian allies. And these guys are fighting out on the frontier, this guerrilla warfare. Colonial villages are attacked out on the frontier and everything else. And what the colonists do is they try to capture Quebec. They prevail, though, in capturing Nova Scotia. Spain comes in on behalf of France, and then there's fighting also taking place down in Georgia, right, which we know was supposed to be sort of a buffer zone from Spanish attack. Eventually, though, we're going to get the Treaty of Utrecht. This is going to end these conflicts in 1713, and that is when the British gained the territory around Hudson Bay and then also Nova Scotia. It was known at that time, though, Acadia. Spain, they get trading rights. I'm sorry. Also, England gains trading rights with Spanish America, right? So England can now go down and trade with Mexico and areas of the Caribbean and things like that because before Spain was working under mercantilism too. All these European countries were. Okay, so this is the territory in pink. and then also in shared that is claimed by Britain. And you need to be aware of where the British colonies are, what the names of these places are. So the NFLD, that's Newfoundland, the NS, that's Nova Scotia, and then you get the British colonies of North America are 13 colonies there. Rupert's Land is that area around the Hudson Bay, which we study that in geography. So that should be familiar with you as well, or to you. All right, so King George's War, this one started out as a different kind of war. It was fighting that broke out in the Caribbean. They're fighting for territory all over the world, India specifically. But with this one, a Spanish ship, it seizes an English ship. And when they do that, they cut off the ear of the captain, Jenkins. So Jenkins goes back with his ear and he delivers it to Parliament. Parliament is outraged. And so this kind of starts the war. And then it evolves into King George's War. So there's fighting that takes place down in Georgia as Spain is attacking from there. And then the New Englanders, they go up to Nova Scotia and that region, Acadia, and they capture a huge fortress known as Louisbourg up there. And it was, it's a hard fought win that they got. They're very proud of what they do, and this gives England control of the St. Lawrence River. So it was a clear cut victory. But there's a peace agreement that the English made in exchange for some land elsewhere. They decide, well, we're going to give you back your fort. The colonists were furious about this, right? Because they had worked so hard to gain that fort. This is a picture of the recreated or the rebuilt fort that is still there today. I don't know how long, I don't know how much of it is original and how much was rebuilt. Okay, so this is going to lead us to the final of those four wars, and this is known as the French and Indian War. And as I said, in Europe, or at least in England, it's known as the 7 Years' War. Okay, it all started down here in the Ohio River Valley. What the French were doing was building up these forts, and you could see them up there just south of Lake Erie, and then going all the way down to Fort Duquesne. So Virginia was concerned about this, and the governor of Virginia sent the young George Washington to expel the French from Fort Duquesne. The only thing is, Washington gets there. He's surrounded at what they call Fort Necessity. You can go and visit Fort Necessity today. It's not much, it's just a patchy wooded area. They have like a historical marker there. It's up in the mountains. There's lots of good hiking and whitewater rafting up there, though. So he goes up there. He's surrounded by the British. It's raining. Their gunpowder gets wet. There's nothing that he can do. And so he has to surrender. And they let Washington go, right? So he is defeated. He surrenders his fort to the French and their native allies. Not very good not a good start for our George Washington. Right. About this time, too, the English are encouraging the colonists to unify, to work together so that they can coordinate their defenses against the French and their Indian allies. Right. So Benjamin Franklin develops a plan of intercolonial unity in order to recruit troops and also collect taxes for this effort. The only thing is, it never took place, right? Because the colonies really were kind of selfish. They didn't want to give up their right for their colonial legislators to tax, so they didn't do that. But it is important that this was the first attempt at unity by them. So it's kind of a precursor. So what happened though is they did go there and they did meet, and colonies did send representatives, but then they sent the plan back to their state legislators, and they're the ones that rejected it. So even though they rejected the plan, they still kind of got together. So that was a good thing for what's going to prevail. All right, and Benjamin Franklin too, he produces that first cartoon for a newspaper, as we talked about the last time. It's kind of it morphs into a few different forms, but it's basically we have to come together or we're going to fail. So join or die. And this is going to also take up a whole new meaning during the Revolutionary War, right? Pretty sure I have a T-shirt with that on there. Oh, I know I do. At least 3. All right, then the English try again, another attack, and this one, General William Edward Braddock, excuse me, goes up and tries to take Fort Duquesne. The only thing is, he's fighting like a British officer where they're marching in these straight lines and they're surrounded by the Native Americans and their French allies, and they're fighting guerrilla warfare. So they are attacked. Braddock is killed, right? And the Algonquins, they go up and down. The whole Appalachian Mountains, just attacking settlements all along the way. So log cabins, families, women, children, everybody, they're attacking, very brutally as they do this. The British then mount an assault on the Ohio River Valley, Acadia, and Newfoundland to try to expel the French. It's not going well. Right. And if you look at this as we enter into this war, you can see we start to see some very stark differences between the Americans, the colonials, and the British, right? Especially in terms of how they're fighting this war. So if you look at the colonials, they're supposed to go and volunteer on behalf of their colony. They're seen by the British as British citizens. It's not quite clear if the Americans think of themselves as British citizens. They do, but the differences start to really become stark between them. Whereas they wouldn't have seen differences before, now they do, that they're in such close contact, right? So anyway, the colonials fight like the Native Americans using guerrilla warfare. The British march in these straight rows with their formations at charge, or with their bayonets at charge and ready. The military organization for the colonials, there really isn't any, and they work for their commander, a colonial commander, not a British commander. The British have that whole rank structure, lieutenant, captain, colonel, general, all those different things, right? And you have to give deference to authority and everything else. Military discipline, there really isn't any for the colonists. They're just kind of lackadaisical. We're just going to go fight these people and go home. But the British, I mean, they're trained professional soldiers, drill and ceremonies, most powerful military in the world, right? They're very stern and that sort of thing. You have to follow strict guidelines. Finances, the colonists don't want to pay. The British want them to pay. So there's conflict there. They're just not working together. The colonists are also very casual, non-professional, but then the British, they fight like, okay, we have to, it's stopping time now, it's time for tea, so it's tea time, that sort of thing. So they're very, very different. Okay, so the war actually begins in, it begins in 1756, when the British formally declare war, right? And so they bring in their allies. So it's the British with their Indian allies, which are the Iroquois, right? And that territory around New York. The Iroquois see that all these people are in their land and they want to expel them. The British see the Iroquois as their royal subjects and they want to control them, right? And then you have the American colonists, of course, fighting on behalf of the British, whether they want to or not. And then you have the French and their Indian allies, who are the Huron, the Abenaki, Lenape, Algonquin, Ijoboa, the Ottawa. All these different tribes here. Later, Spain is going to get involved on the side of France. So it's England against all these other countries and people. Oh, and then of course the American allies too. Okay, so certain events occur as they're moving up, trying to attack Canada. This is an incident occurs that is portrayed in the movie The Last of the Mohicans, which we're going to watch on Sunday. But this fort was built to shore up British defenses. It's up there on Lake George, and the French, under the Marquis de Montcalm, attacks the fort. They're victorious. He allows everybody to leave peacefully and surrender the fort to the French. Well, the Indians don't like that. The Indians want the booty, right? And by booty, you go in and take all the wealth of the captives. And Montcalm says, no, we're going to be civilized. We're going to let them leave. The Indians are mad about this. So as the English leave, and at this time, it's not just soldiers. We've got men, women, children who kind of follow it, locals who are there too. As they're leaving, they are brutally and ruthlessly attacked by the Native Americans, who just massacre hundreds. So things weren't going very well for the British, but then the tide starts to turn. After Fort William Henry, Lord Loudoun where he was defeated. He was relieved of command, right? And then William Pitt becomes the new foreign minister, and William Pitt incorporates a new strategy and policy for North America. What he wants to do is he wants to focus all of their attention on invading Canada. He also tells the colonials, um, England will fund the war. You just need to provide the militias to fight the war and aid in your defenses, right? So we need your military loyalty. And so they decide to do that. Morale is lifted, and it's easier to fight the war at that time because now you have militia volunteers that do that. Okay, so here, if you look at this map, you can kind of see some of those locations that we were talking about, right? So if you go up here, this right here is Fort William Henry, and that's where a lot of civilians were massacred up there by Lake George and Lake Champlain. Then, as I said, um, the British focus their attention on invading Canada, and so they take back this fort right here, Louisbourg, right? And it's up north of Nova Scotia there. That also gives them access to the St. Lawrence River, and they start coming down this way. They also come in from the Great Lakes around Lake Ontario here. They capture Fort Fond du Lac, and then they can take the river this way. Eventually, everything is going to end right here at Quebec at the Plains of Abraham, right? And then the war will be over, right? So the battle for Quebec, as we led up to that, we have General James Wolfe, who is the commander of British forces up there, and he is in opposition to the Marquis de Montcalm of France. The fighting takes place up on this huge cliff that the British scale. The British are able to defeat the French. The French surrender, and Montreal then would fall in 1760. Okay, here you can see this is a painting that was done posthumously. Benjamin West, we looked at this the last chapter, a very famous painting showing the hero Wolfe as he lays dying from his injuries from the battles there in Quebec. All right, and then we come to 1763, and 1763 is going to be the peace treaty between the French, the Spanish, and the English following the French and Indian War. Okay, so here we get the Treaty of Paris, and you can see this is all the players are there. They meet in Paris and they come up with an agreement. France loses all of its North American holdings. You can see, though, if you look at it, they still maintain control of Haiti down there on the island of Hispaniola, but that is it. Right? They lost all their other holdings. They lost their land claims in India. They lost all that land, Louisiana, that is west of the Mississippi River. Spain gained that land west of the Mississippi in exchange for the losses that they had to support the French. So the French kind of gave them that, and England just let them. They also got control of New Orleans, but Spanish Florida went to England. England also gained all of the French territory to the Mississippi River, and then exclusive rights to trade in the Caribbean, and then with the slave trade, and then exclusive rights to India. All right, so the immediate effects of the war is that England's no longer challenged its supremacy in North America. It is the most powerful military in North America. They're the dominant naval power in the world. There's no longer a threat from the French in North America. But the bad part is they're very, very deeply in debt. So what the English do, they pivot and they really change how they govern North America. And there's some prevailing thoughts that they keep with them and the Americans, where there's all this friction between the American colonists and the British following the war, over the fighting of the war, over paying for the war, a lot of different aspects of it. Okay, if you look at all these opposing viewpoints as a result of the war, British feel that the war they left the war with a low opinion of the Americans. They held them in contempt because the way that the militia worked and functioned, that sort of thing. They're also very upset because the colonists didn't want to foot the bill or pay for the bill for the war, and they were convinced that the colonists were one unwilling or unable to take care of themselves and defend the frontier. The Americans, on the other hand, were quite proud of the role that they played in all four of the wars. They believed that they could provide their own defenses, and they were not very impressed with the British leadership. Right? They thought too that their methods of warfare were unsuited to the American frontier, which of course they were. Right. So for the colonies, the one thing, if you remember, with the Great Awakening, that was a unifying experience that the colonies had. So this is another thing that they had too. They were united in the fact that they had a common enemy, which was the French. Right. So it kind of brought them together. They start to know each other in different colonies, and so they kind of socialization experience that was created, but they also share bitter feelings towards the British, and those feelings intensify. There's tension out on the frontier because they're fearful of the Native Americans, and for the Native Americans, they could no longer pit one European group against the other. Right? They only had one major power now, and that was the British. So they were really in a precarious position after the war. They kind of had to toe the line with the British, or fight, or just surrender. Okay, so here's an essential question. What were the events, if as we go looking through this, that changed people's attitudes and brought about American independence? So Americans, they weren't calling for independence or anything like that, but gradually over time, that sort of movement and belief structure emerged. So what were the events that led to that, for that happening? So, as I indicated, there are events that are going to take place in which England and its American colonists there's going to be tension that's going to continue to increase and exacerbate, and eventually the Americans are going to declare their independence. This is not something that had to happen. I mean, it's just 12 years after the end of the French and Indian War. A lot of different events take place. But what we know is that Americans they developed a certain character, right? And they had some ideals and beliefs that were put in place. And when those things were violated, um, that's when tensions mounted, right? They had respect for republicanism, which means that they believed that they should have representative government. They didn't like corrupt government, and this they thought was expressed in the quote radical Whigs of Parliament. They also believed in self government, not Delft government, but self government. They believed in property ownership, that that's one of the natural rights and that it should be protected. And they also believed in social mobility, something that was still not possible in a lot of European countries. Okay, so what the British do is they decide to reorganize their empire. So prior to the war, they had been practicing salutary neglect. That's where they had these laws for the Navigation Acts in place. They just didn't really enforce them. Now they're starting to enforce them. Also, they didn't have a lot of troops over here before. Now they do. They're maintaining a huge number of forces in order to protect the American frontier. But it seems like they're not really protecting the frontier. After a while, it seems like they are there just to exacerbate conflict, or have this horrible relationship with their British subjects, right? So it seemed as if they were oppressing the British instead of protecting them. Also, they're seeking to get money out of the colonists by increasing taxes, right? They wanted to lift the burden off of the British citizens who had been paying for the war. Then another event occurs after the French and Indian War that worsens the situation between the English and the American colonists. The British really upset the Native Americans following the French and French and Indian War, because those Native Americans who are in formerly French territory feel as if their rights are being infringed upon. They're no longer able to trade with the French, and they had become accustomed to that and dependent upon that over time. Also, the person in charge, the French person or the British person in charge, Amherst, General Amherst, he had publicly executed an Indian woman for committing some crime. And besides that, a whole bunch of settlers keep coming out onto their territory and settling on what they perceive to be their land. So if you look here, the bottom point, or the second main one, um, Ottawa Chief Pontiac, he had this vision that he was going to unite all of the Indians together to fight off the British. This sounds familiar, it's because it's very familiar to King Philip's War. King Philip did the same thing. So Pontiac goes all up and down. I mean, they get Indians from the upper Midwest all the way down to near New Orleans, and they unite them. And so the Native Americans launch these simultaneous attacks on these British forts. Not just that, but they ruthlessly attack. Colonial settlements all along the Appalachian Mountains, right? So the American colonists are in a very dire position, much worse than probably what they were during the French and Indian War. Okay, so much so, there's a group of Scots Irish. I shouldn't laugh because this is horrible what happened. I'm just thinking these Scots Irish, probably about 20 or 30 Irishmen get together, and some say that they were drunk. They had been drinking, and they're like, "We're going to get back at the Indians," and they go and attack an innocent group of Conestoga Indians, Susquehannock, near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They were doing nothing. They hadn't been involved in any attacks whatsoever. But for these Paxton boys, and the Paxton boys are called that because they're from Paxton, Pennsylvania. They didn't care. They were just going to attack any Indian. So it was a horrific incident of massacre and mutilation of these bodies, but the group was never prosecuted, which just kind of shows you the attitude of the colonists at the time, that Indian rights just didn't matter. Okay, so this right here is Chief Pontiac. Pontiac. He kind of goes down in American lore. After the rebellion, he ends up going and retreating here to Illinois, but he's killed by some Peoria Indians. And if you've ever been to Starved Rock, the legend has it that in retaliation for killing them, um, there's some Indians that were kind of starved out on this rock, on what is now Starved Rock, and that's why they call it that. Whether it's true or not, we don't know, but it's kind of a cool story. All right. The outcome of this, Pontiac's forces were defeated by the British, and the British negotiated peace rather than continuing to fight. They do place all of the blame on Jeffrey Amherst, who was the commander at the time. And one thing that he had done, and this has gone down, is debated by a lot of historians on whether he did or didn't, or if it was or was not successful. But Amherst had written that he wanted to infect the Indians with smallpox. And some people say that what they did is they somehow put the smallpox pus or that sort of thing in some blankets that they gave to the Indians, hoping that that would infect them. But the debate is out there still on whether or not that was successful or if it even happened. Some people swear by it, but if it were true, that would be a form of attempted genocide, right? Now, he was replaced by a general, Thomas Gage. And Gage, what we're going to find is he's going to be one of those commanders during the Revolutionary War on the British side. So keep that in mind. A lot of these British who fought in the French and Indian War, we're going to see again. So one thing that the British do, which probably was the right thing to do in terms of what the Indians needed and justice for the Indians, is they were going to reserve the land west of the Appalachian Mountains for the Indians. The colonists didn't like that. They thought that they had fought the war for that purpose, for that land. So the colonists are going to be angry. The Indians temporarily will be happy. So you can see right there the red line that runs all the way up from Maine down to Florida is the Proclamation of 1763, and British citizens were forbidden from crossing over that line and settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And as I said, Americans were not happy about that. And historically, if we know anything about Americans, if they don't like a rule, they just don't follow it. Right. So they didn't. And thousands move across the mountains and they settle in that land. So, to offset the debt that the British had as a result of the war, they start to impose all these taxes. And at the time, the prime minister was a guy by the name of Lord George Grenville. And so, here are the taxes that they passed: the Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, and the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act to the colonists is going to be the worst, right? They also passed laws that require that the government enforce their navigation acts, and they ordered that all smugglers who were caught be tried in admiralty courts without a jury. And to do that, they could use writs of assistance, which was basically a free pass to go and search anybody's home suspected of smuggling. You didn't need a search order or anything like that. Anybody could go into your home and just look for anything, just to check for smuggling. Okay, so as I said, these admiralty courts, they did assume that people were guilty until proven innocent. Well, I didn't say that, but I talked about them. Also, they were used to enforce the jurisdiction over shipping. No jury trial. This was really a violation of people's rights as British citizens. Because if you look at the English Bill of Rights of 1689, it says that you're entitled to a trial by jury. So a lot of Americans thought that this was wrong. There's also these writs of assistance. As I said, British officials could enter your home. They didn't have to have advance notice, no probable cause, and they didn't have to give a reason. So colonists really felt as if their rights were being infringed upon. James Otis, as a matter of fact, he was a well-known lawyer from Massachusetts, and he was a leading figure in the 1760s. His status kind of diminished. It was a weird case. Well, one thing, people thought that he was kind of crazy, but some say it was suffering from mental disorder caused by alcoholism, and also because he had been hit by a British officer. And then, weirdly enough, he was going to end up dying by getting hit by lightning. He was struck by lightning. But anyway, he's well known for the writs of assistance case. It's also known as the James Otis case, right? He went in and he argued that Parliament's law writing or legislative ability does not supersede the natural rights of man. And one of your natural rights as a man during this age of reason, the time of John Locke, is your right to own property. So they should not be allowed to come in and search your home, your property, without just cause. Right? He's also the one that coined the phrase "no taxation without representation." So that's kind of going to be a rallying cry throughout the colonies. Right. Another act that they passed was the Quartering Act. Now, many people think incorrectly that soldiers could just go live in your home. Actually, it stated that the colonies had to provide barracks for the soldiers. So some of them built them. In Boston, for example, they built them on island. Off the coast so that they wouldn't be that close to the citizens, but the soldiers kept trying. The commanders wanted them to be close, kind of like they were regulating the citizens, not protecting them. Um, so you had to have that. If you didn't have the barracks, and there could be inns, as it says here, livery stables, alehouses, all sorts of things. It was only if all other resources were exhausted that then they could go into your home. Now, no doubt some commanders would just go there and say, oh, there's nothing here but homes. We're going to stay in your house, right? And probably they were abused. They abused the people. They overextended their welcome. It was expensive to house them. You had to feed them and everything else. Um, so that was the case. Royal governors were supposed to oversee this policy, but again, this was a violation of the English Bill of Rights of 1689 because one thing that it says is no quartering of soldiers during peacetime, right? And no standing armies during peacetime. So colonists feel as if their rights are being infringed upon, rightly so. Right, and then there's the Sugar Act. Now, not many people cared about this. It was aimed at a couple of things: to raise revenues and to halt the smuggling of sugar coming in from French or Spanish colonies. Um, People didn't really mind this because it was kind of like an import tax. It was a duty on the people, the merchants who bought this. It was considered to be a luxury good. So there wasn't much ruckus about that. People didn't really say much as a result of that. They're going to say a lot about this one, though. So, in the past, colonists are used to being taxed, but they're taxed by their colonial legislatures, right? And they're to pay for different things within their colony. But they were never taxed by Parliament. This is a direct tax on Parliament on anything that you used that was basically made of paper. It was on printed material, right? Then you had to go and get this tax. You had to get this stamp, so it was legal documents, playing cards, all sorts of different things. So this was a direct tax, and this was imposed by Parliament, not people they elected. And remember, Americans respect a Republican form of government, and again, they feel their rights are being violated. Right. So the response to it, it's all American, right? First thing they do, there's the legislatures and in the press. So in Virginia, it was Patrick Henry. He spoke out about it in the Virginia House of Burgesses as a very young, new, well, not so young, but a new representative. He, at this point, not saying give me liberty or give me death. That would be probably about 9 years later, 10 years later. Um, there's also the Stamp Act Congress. Now, this is the second attempt at a unity. So here, representatives from 9 of the colonies, they meet in New York and they expressed opposition to the tax and tried to figure out what their plan would be to coordinate their opposition to that. Then there are protests. Some of them were pretty radical, like the one on the right here. So you get two different groups together. You get the Sons of Liberty, that was formed to protest this, and they would do things to harass and intimidate the tax collector. And in some cases, they did do what is seen right here, which was really quite damaging to people. They would pour very hot tar on people that sometimes would give them, third-degree burns, and then put feathers on them. So you'd be tarred and feathered and forced to drink all sorts of alcohol or whatever, really to humiliate you. And make you look bad. Nobody wanted to be a tax collector if this is going to happen to you. And so that they would do that. There was also the Sons of or the Daughters of Liberty, and some people say that they were more radical. A lot of what they did, though, was help to organize the protests. So probably the most successful thing, I'm saying the most successful thing, were the boycotts. Now, boycott is when you swear not to buy something from England. So people are like, we're not going to buy from you. So at this point in time, um, England was producing cloth and the colonists were buying it. But what they started to do is get homespun. Women started to make their own cloth. They would get sewing bees and everything else to not buy colonial goods or other types of goods. So this was really hurting British merchants. So this was quite successful. Okay. Grenville is replaced as prime minister because things are not going well in England. Businesses are hurting because the colonists aren't buying their products. And so the new prime minister, and to be honest with you, I'm not sure what his name is. Um, I don't think that you care. It's not Townsend, but we get another prime minister, and he encourages Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, which they do, and the colonists are very happy about this. But at the same time, Parliament passes this one act known as the Declaratory Act. It doesn't really do anything. It just says we have the right to make whatever laws we choose or deem fit to govern over you in all cases whatsoever. It's like, okay, but colonists really weren't paying attention to that. So the Stamp Act is repealed. All right, so things are kind of quiet for a while, but then we're going to enter into that second phase of conflict between the colonists and the British. And that begins with another round of acts. This is known as the Townshend Act. So in England, their treasurer is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And at this time, the new one that they get is Charles Townshend. They called him Champagne Charlie. I'm not sure why. But then he issues a whole new series of laws and taxes and everything else on them. And the main one are the taxes to increase revenue that's going to pay for the colonial officials there in the colonies. Right. And so they put a tax on the luxury goods, lead, paint, glass, tea. Right. So be, what made the colonists really upset, aside from the fact that it is a direct tax, is that they're taking away the colonial legislature's ability um, to have the power to pay those royal dignitaries or the people, the colonial officials, right? So if the people who are paying them are here in the colonies, then they have to serve them, right? But now the money is going to the king, and the king is going to pay them, not the colonial legislatures. So they have to be beholden to the king, right? So this is like a slap on your left cheek and then one on your right cheek, right? It's like, A, you're going to pay a tax to pay for these people that aren't going to be necessarily supporting you, but supporting the crown. So people didn't like that. It also, this act also, or these acts, provided for the search of private homes using writs of assistance. And when New York was defiant in enforcing the Quartering Act or abiding by the Quartering Act, then they no longer could have a colonial legislature. So we've ticked off Massachusetts and New York and quite a few of these different places by now. All right, so lots of opposition. It's kind of the same response to the Townsend Acts as what we originally saw with the I'm sorry, with the Stamp Act, right? So we get some people writing out there. One person, John Dickinson, he writes letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, a series of them, right? And here he argues that taxes cannot be levied against people without their consent. So this is essentially no taxation without representation. There's also this circular, this letter that goes around, um, and it's going to all the colonial legislatures, urging them to appeal to Parliament to repeal these taxes, right? To put down all of this, what England does is sends more troops, especially to Boston. They see that Boston is like the troublemakers, so they want to control it. We get another round of boycotts, right? And again, the women resort to spinning bees and homespun. And then we get another round of protests. And sometimes those are violent. Now, John Hancock, he's a very famous person, probably the richest person in the colonies at the time. And he was an import export business, and he had a series of ships. Well, one of his ships, the Liberty, was seized by the Royal Navy, and it was commissioned as one of their ships. I think that he had been smuggling something, or there was some Madeira wine on it, or something, and so they seize it and they take the ship, and then some colonists are like, well, rather than them having it, let's just burn it. And so they do. So there's one example of some violent, increasingly violent behavior. So this is a copy of a portion or a segment of one of the letters of a letter from a Pennsylvania farmer that John Dickinson wrote. And basically all he's doing in here is just arguing for the repeal of the Townsend Acts, right, to get rid of them. And they are successful. They are repealed. We get another prime minister. This one, Frederick North, comes in and he urges that the Townsend Acts be repealed by Parliament. And, they keep going back and forth. In England, the majority party gets to choose it's kind of like a Speaker of the House, and that person is the Prime Minister, and they have a lot of say. But the thing about this tax is that it was not bringing in a lot of revenue, and it was hurting trade, much like the Stamp Act was, right? But after this is repealed, there's going to be some relative calm in the colonies for a few years, with the exception, of course, of the Boston Massacre. So I think you all know the story about this, but maybe you don't know the background to it. As more and more troops were sent there to uphold all of these new laws, there's tension that was created between the British soldiers and the colonists. And in Boston, there were only about 20,000 people, but there were about 4,000 soldiers. So every, one in five people is a soldier. And so tensions are pretty high. Then one sort of wintry night in March, um, a group of soldiers is surrounded and people are throwing snowballs at them, snowballs with rocks in them. They're throwing them, calling them all sorts of names. And then one soldier fires, and then pretty soon others are firing. And in the end, 5 people are killed. I think something like 6 are injured. The first person killed was Crispus Attucks. He was a black man in Boston, and many people say that he was the first victim or a hero who fell in the Revolutionary War. But anyway, these soldiers go to prison and they're tried for murder. But John Adams is a very accomplished lawyer. He takes the case and they are acquitted, meaning they're found not guilty. But his cousin, Sam Adams, he goes, and I think Paul Revere did a etching of this, and they put it in the papers, and they call it a massacre. A massacre. So they propagandize it to kind of get a lot of people supportive of, yeah, the British are awful, right? So this is the engraving that Paul Revere did, and it just shows, look at the blood and spilling, and the British soldiers are just firing upon them as if they're standing in a straight line, right? Okay, so what we're going to get, some more protests. One thing that continued since the Stamp Act Congress was this Committee of Correspondence. This was established by Sam Adams, and what people do is they exchange letters from colony to colony to kind of plan their attack against the British. And as you're going to see from the videos that you're watching, the spy network and everything else, you can even detect some things here in this letter if you can read cursive. But it talks about liberty for all and everything else. So you're kind of passing on these ideas from one place to another. The Virginia House of Burgesses does something very similar. This is called the Intercolonial Committee. So they're just kind of sending information throughout the colonies, and it's not in favor of the British. And then another incident occurs. This is the Gaspee. So this is a British customs ship. It was charged with going, and you would go and kind of not raid another ship, but halt a ship that was out there sailing and inspect it and see what's on it. So it was a custom ship that checked to make sure nobody was smuggling. And it runs aground in Rhode Island, and the people there, they dress up as Native Americans, and then they go and set it on fire. This really makes the British angry. They commission this whole or they established this whole commission to try and find out who did it. As far as I know, they never did find out who did it, and then they were going to try them in England. So trying them far away, not a jury of your peers here. And then we get the Boston Tea Party, right? So they imposed this tax on tea. It wasn't a big deal, right? There wasn't that much money, but it was passed by Parliament to help out the British East India Company. So they had all of this tea. Now, if a colonist wanted to have tea and they imported it from the Dutch and they smuggled it, that would have been expensive. This tea was cheap, but for Americans, it was the principle. It was no taxation without representation. So the tea is sitting in Boston Harbor and nobody's buying it. So it's just sitting there on 3 ships, right? So one night, a group of people meet, and most of them is believed are with the Sons of Liberty, probably stirred up by John Hancock and Sam Adams, but they dressed as Native Americans and they go onto these ships. It takes them 3 hours. There are 100 men, 340 chests of tea, and they dump it into Boston Harbor. Right. Today's value for that tea would be about $1 million. So it was a huge deal. It could not go unpunished. So what the English did is they passed these laws, which the colonists call the Intolerable Act, but the British call the Coercive Act. Coercive means coerce. We're going to kind of force you to do something. So Boston, a major shipping town, they had their port closed by the British until all the tea was paid for, which would have been very, very difficult to do. And then there was the Massachusetts Government Act, which suspended the Massachusetts legislature. So they can't make any money and no more self government, right? Another thing is the Justice Act, right, where they said that British officials were going to be tried in England, not here in America. There's going to be a whole new quartering act, and then one that the book puts separate. It's the Quebec Act. The colonists didn't like this because it extended the border of Canada all the way down to the Ohio River. Not only that, it made Catholicism legal, and it kind of ruled over the Canadians, where the Canadians didn't really have self-government. Almost finished. All right, something that your book doesn't talk about is that the monarch at the time, I don't think it does, was King George III. Now, for a long time, the lineage to the throne of England, the king or queen was actually born in another country, like Germany, what is today Germany. But King George III was actually born in England, even though he did speak German. He becomes king at the young age of 22. His father died, and then his grandfather died, making him king, right? He believed that Parliament really was the sovereign. He wasn't, because the Bill of Rights of 1689 made him that so. So he didn't believe that he was going to be this autocratic ruler, right? But he did rely very heavily upon the Privy Council, which really was criticized for being very naive at the time with their ideas. So he believed that problems in America came from being too lenient with them. So he was for stern rules against England. And so after the Boston Tea Party, he thought that there should be coercive measures used against them. So he agreed with the coercive acts. All right. So last thing, I think, yeah, pretty close. In terms of this all coincides with the movement that's taking place at the time that really had been taking place for quite a few years, which is the Enlightenment. So people are questioning the divine right of kings. They're questioning scripture. They're questioning religious authority. There's the age of reason and kind of work things out. So because of this, our founding fathers, such as the ones in the painting to the right, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, they had read the works of people like John Locke on two treatises of government, talking about natural rights, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who kind of echoed those same sentiments as many people did during that time. They believed that the people should be governed to protect their natural rights, and that you had certain rights. There are also people like Benjamin Franklin who were deists, right? They believed that God established the natural laws, and that there really wasn't that divine intervention into the everyday lives of people. So this thought, the way of thinking, is going to encourage them to write a Declaration of Independence and separate. And that's exactly what they do. And this is supposed to depict them writing that here. Okay, and last thing I wanted to show you, this is a political cartoon. And it kind of reminds me of a story, which I guess I'll tell you now, but very quickly. I went to go visit FDR's home in Hyde Park, New York. And we go in there, and there are a whole bunch of political cartoons from the American Revolution. And the King of England and the Queen were supposed to come and visit Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and this was during World War II. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt's mother, who still lived in the home, she's like, "You need to take down these cartoons before the king comes, and there will be no alcohol that we're going to drink." And Franklin Delano Roosevelt's like, "Yeah, Mom, you know." But then on the day that the king came, the cartoons were still up, and the mother was just mortified, right? But the king and the queen come in, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt welcome them. The mother's standing there, and the king comes into, and there's this big foyer, and you go in, and he goes in, crosses it, and he starts looking at all these cartoons and reading them. And he turned to FDR, and he said, "You have some that I don't have." So they both collected these cartoons from the Revolutionary period. Oh, and then FDR says, "Would you like a cocktail?" And he said, "Yes, I would." So it was kind of a funny story. You can get those funny stories if you go visit these things. But this is a hysterical cartoon. So England is depicted on the left, and the wild, savage America is depicted on the right. The female combatants, or who shall, I don't know, do something. But England is saying, "Oh, I'll force you." It should be, "I'll force you to obedience, you rebellious slut." And then America is saying, "Liberty, liberty forever, mother, while I exist." Anyway, I'll leave you on that note. Thank you for listening. Good luck on your quizzes. I know you're going to do great.